let me take you back, actually, to the autumn before 2015, when we were thinking about Magna Carta. I was at the Institute of Historical Research in the University of London, and I received an invitation from Professor Cheng Dan, the leading Chinese historian of Britain, to bring a party of historians to the University of Beijing in the following year, 2015. I replied, what should be the subject of the conference? Who should I recruit to bring to Beijing? And he replied very shortly, Magna Carta, of course. And so in the 800th year, the anniversary year of the signing of the Great Charter of Runnymede, and at a time when we had, if you recall, about 10 years ago, a kind of golden relationship, as it was called, with China before the full dimensions of Chinese ambitions and aggressions became clear, I recruited a group of 7 historians to go to the University of Beijing and to meet there another group of Chinese historians to talk about Magna Carta. And I'm delighted to say that we were given funds by the 800 Committee, which actually still exists, to finance the trip. It was run by Bob Worcester, if you remember him, who ran the polling organisations and used to appear on election nights on the BBC, in better times, I think, for the BBC. Those who came with included Nicholas Vincent from the University of East Anglia, one of our leading experts on Magna Carta, David Carpenter from King's College London, and George Garnett from Oxford. And as I say, in Beijing, we were met by an equal number of Chinese scholars, and for 3 days we engaged in really one of the most interesting academic events of my career. The Chinese, let me see if I can get there. Yes, now that's the kind of program of the conference, and the Chinese, off their own bat, had entitled it Retrospect and Prospect. And the word prospect rather interested us. What did they mean, as it were, about the future? I think it was really rather a brave thing for Chinese scholars to do. I think that Professor Cheng Dan and his colleagues were signalling thereby their admiration for British traditions, as we've heard from Gary, of due process, trial by jury, and individual rights under the law, which Magna Carta was designed to secure. And we met in Beijing a group of lively, open-minded, clever, curious scholars and students who wanted to know about Britain and the West. Many of the postgraduates there really impressed us. Some of them had already spent time in Britain doing their dissertations, researching them. Some, in fact, have come since, and several of us have hosted them and helped them with their work, and found among them a very great curiosity about the West and our traditions of individual rights. After the conference, Professor Cheng Dan took me on a sort of personal tour of the Forbidden City in the centre of Beijing. And amidst all the crowds there, great throngs of people going to see these remarkable sites in Beijing, he told me his story. He was a young lad of promise, aged 17, at the time of the Cultural Revolution. And he was purged. Now, you probably recall that many of the professors were sent into the paddy fields. That's our image of what being purged in the Cultural Revolution was like. But he was sent to a small factory in a provincial town, and for 8 years he worked on a production line. That was his penance for being a clever young man who was good at Western languages, and that was suspicious to those who led the Cultural Revolution. As he explained to me, Most of those people of that age who were purged never recovered from it. But he was able to start his education over again. Once the Cultural Revolution had passed in the 1970s, he went to college, he became an expert in English and then an expert in British history. And he told me all this in the middle of the Forbidden City, so he could not be overheard. Amongst throngs of people, anyone listening would not have been able to pick up what he was saying to me. Now, the whole experience affirmed the international importance of British history and the international respect for the British historical experience. Our development of legal and constitutional rights, as Peter has said already this morning, of representative government, of religious toleration, were admired by these Chinese scholars. They admired also our role as pioneers of the technology and the business organization that made the Industrial Revolution and made the modern world. We were also, and this is very interesting, we were also the nation of Shakespeare, and they admired that also. There could be no doubting their admiration. And let me just show you just a few images. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of the Chinese, which was a great shame. But this was the book that we produced, Magna Carta, History, Context and Influence, papers delivered at Peking University on the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And we called it Peking University because they call it Peking University. It is to the Chinese PKU, and they're very proud of that. And they fight the regime over that. They were founded by American missionaries in the 1890s. And they've called it Peking University. And these are traditionalists, actually, at heart. And they call it PKU to this day. So we did as well. And this is the title page, the contents page, and you can see the different papers that were given. I talked a little bit about historic anniversaries, and then we had a series of papers on Magna Carta and how it was made at the beginning of the 13th century, and then people talked a little bit more about its influence subsequently in subsequent centuries, all the way down to 19th century Britain. And I think it made a useful contribution to Magna Carta studies. And here's a little article, I'm afraid the pictures really are bad, that I wrote for the sort of local history magazine at the Institute of Historical Research. But when we came back to that. There we were in 2015 in China. Taking really the admiration of Chinese scholars, but we returned to a country where roads must fall. It was a country, in a way, beginning to undergo a cultural revolution of its own, in which, as in China in the 1960s, the traditional identity of the nation, the British nation, was being challenged and questioned in the most crude and crass ways. And that's taken in 2016. In fact, the Roads Must Fall movement started in the autumn of 2014, so somewhat earlier. If you know the High Street in Oxford and you know what you're looking at, you can see Cecil Rhodes right at the top there, that rather small statue. He's not very big on the facade of Oriel College, which he heavily endowed to his great credit. But Cecil is there in 2016, and I can assure you he's still there today, actually. They haven't got... Some clever manoeuvring by the current provost of Oriel has ensured that he's there, and I'm sure will stay forever. I was very intrigued by the whole cultural explosion around this time in regard to monuments and statues and so forth. And then I organised with another colleague another conference, this time in London in 2017, on the theme of attacking founders, benefactors and institutions. And I invited speakers from both sides of the argument. And this was another little book, Dethroning Historical Reputations, we called it, Universities, Museums and the Commemoration of Benefactors, although commemoration is a rather interesting word there because they haven't always been commemorated in recent years. They've been defiled or they've been insulted. But we put this together and brought out this little book. Now we'll talk a little bit about History Reclaimed in a moment. I was really rather interested in this whole problem. What did I learn? Why have we been pitched into this folly of undermining and falsifying our own history? Now, in part, I would explain the recent assaults on national history as the natural revisionism of youth. Many generations have turned on those generations that have come before them. It's very common in academic life. You have to make a name for yourself, so you better, as it were, insult those who taught you. And that's par for the course and something we all have to put up with. I was a young Turk once, I suppose, is a way of putting it. But I think this time round, we've lived through an attack on history based on sources, on evidence, on common sense, on facts themselves. This has been more than a reinterpretation, an overturning of the fathers. This has been a straight, flat rejection of our history, and indeed a rejection of how to write history properly. In fact, I think it started earlier. Those of you who were in universities and colleges in the 1970s and the 1980s might have encountered the rise of theory in the humanities. There are all the isms, structuralism and post-structuralism, and of course Marxism in all its many, many varieties. And it was through these distorting lenses that we were encouraged to see the past. And what many people saw when they looked through these lenses was what they wanted to see, not what actually was there, not what actually happened. Now, many historians, and I was one of them, thought that with the fall of communism in Europe at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s, the age of ideology would come to an end, and the study of history would actually break free of all of these artificial constructs. And of course, we were wrong. Although socialism as an economic and political philosophy had failed and was proven to be destructive of rights, of wealth, of incentives, the campaign against history itself began to move in the 1990s to a new field of battle, a new contestation, and that was the field of culture, as Peter said in his opening remarks. And to the credit of Peter and those around him, I think they were ahead of the curve, and they saw the development of the cultural battlefield before many of us were aware of it. From the late 1990s, one could sense the origins of what are called culture wars, though I dislike that term, particularly in British and American universities, as new ideologies based on different categories were developed and, of course, weaponized. Where once the arguments had been about class and about power, they were now about gender, ethnicity, victimhood, race. Personal identity became the dominant way of thinking about the past among a new generation of historians. And I mean here more than the identity of historical figures in the past, but the identities of the historians themselves. People began to write and to read history, not by understanding the past in its own context and in its own terms, but in relation to their identities. often their assumed identities as opposed to their real backgrounds. There are many historians who've adopted a particular posture or identity, but when you really know them, it's not at all where they've come from. Increasingly, we were subject to readings of history, often racial or ethnic readings of history, and the application of today's categories in situations where they don't belong. Indeed, they have no place because, as in those famous words that open that lovely novel, The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley, the past is another country. They do things differently there. All this was, and it still is, obviously wrong, but the arrogance and the self-centeredness of many scholars and their students led them to place themselves at the center of historical analysis, not the historical actors. And as this distortion of history and the historian's role reached really an epidemic scale at the beginning of this decade, the 2020s, so the organization that I represent here today, History Reclaimed, was born. Now, we're a group of academic historians who've come together in part to fight back and in part to try to indicate how history should be written, really as an intellectual discipline dedicated to explaining the past in its terms, not ours. Let me show you some slides, and if you don't know our website, let me encourage you to go and take a look. I'll come back to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge in a moment and tell you a sorry tale. But let's just look at some of the things we do. Colonialism and slavery are the subjects that we seem to write about most because those have been the key areas where the attack upon British history has developed. And this is a very recent review that we published of two books, Michael Banner, Dean of Trinity College, Cambridge, and Martin Percy, also Dean at one point of Christ Church in Oxford, so two very, very notable Anglican scholars, rather controversial in Percy's case, writing books about Anglicanism's feeling of guilt towards the past. But we do straightforward things. This is a wonderful review by Saul David of a wonderful book, The Price of Victory, A Naval History of Britain, 1815 to 1945, by Nick Rodger. Well worth reading, a history of the Royal Navy. It's the third of 3 volumes, a total history of the Royal Navy that Nick Rodger has produced over his long and distinguished career. Andrew Roberts, Lord Roberts of Belgravia, recently ennobled, of course, very notable historian and biographer of Churchill, writes for us quite often. And Churchill, of course, is often vilified because of his enormous significance in the 20th century and really his quintessence of Englishness. And Andrew Roberts there wrote a recent piece. I've written some stuff on Churchill as well for the website, but I defer to Andrew as the expert. Churchill was not the villain. Currently, we're embroiled in an argument with the Home Office. Yes, indeed. There are many arguments to be had with the Home Office. Ours is over a history course, which we got wind of, which wasn't exactly compulsory, but you really did have to attend. And it was on the history of migration to this country. And we were passed some documents which showed that it was astonishingly ignorant and biased and foolish in the way it had been constructed. So we published an article on it, and actually we then discovered that within the Home Office there were people, malcontents, who realised they were being fed propaganda. And a former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, wrote in our favour and said that had she stayed on as Home Secretary for a little longer, she might have got to the bottom of it. But there were layers of bureaucracy and officials between her and getting the history right, and she wasn't successful. So those are the sorts of campaigns that we do. Marcus Rutherford wrote a very fine legal analysis for us of the case for slavery reparations. Perhaps not, was his conclusion. But these are the kinds of things that you would find on our website, written by people who I'd like to think are rather expert in their field. Well, having said that, I come up. But you may have read in the paper that the Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, has removed something like 300 portraits from the Palace of Westminster over recent weeks and months of the most notable figures in British history. In High Dudgeon, I wrote a piece, Pride's Purge, which is a play on a great event in 1649, because it is a kind of pride, isn't it, that makes you think how proud he must feel, but how foolish to remove from the scene of our history all our greatest figures. And I think there's going to be more about that in due course. There's a statement why we are reclaiming history that dates from 2021, which I commend to you. The founder of the group, the person at the centre, is Professor Robert Toombs from Cambridge, from St John's College, Cambridge, and you could do no worse than listen to a very good lecture he gave in Australia last year, which we have on the website. On that question, are the history wars worth fighting? So let me commend it to you. If you don't know it already, just Google History Reclaimed and you can find out more. Now, let me go back just to give you an example. I hope I've got time to the problem of Cambridge. Now, I was educated in Cambridge, and I will just briefly give you this as a sequence of events and an example of a great institution overcome by error, propaganda, and prejudice. So I was educated there, and I taught for 30 years in the other place in Oxford. But I have some, I hedge my bets on boat race day. But I have some favour for the place in the Fens. And 5 years ago, Cambridge, I think you could say, set out to lacerate itself before the world, seeking evidence of its direct involvement in the slave trade and slavery itself. And the fact that it's not been able to find any such evidence of direct involvement hasn't deterred it. If the evidence doesn't exist, then it must be invented. And let me take you through it. And it's a serious matter when one of the greatest universities of the world involves itself in this nonsense and lunacy. And I'll try to be brief. The university set up a committee, the so-called Legacies of Slavery Committee. It didn't include any historian who works in the crucial period, which is really the 17th and 18th centuries. No early modern British historian was on that committee. All sorts of other people, classicists, archaeologists, but no historian of Britain. And it quickly fixed, this committee, on one relatively minor figure in our history, a cavalier, Tobias Rustat, who fought in the First Civil War for his king, who went into exile with Charles II in the 1650s, who came back at the Restoration, and who was sent by his king, by Charles II, to whom he'd been loyal throughout his life. He was sent by him to be a director of the Royal African Company, founded in the 1670s, which did indeed trade in slaves. Now, there are two monuments to Rustat in Cambridge. One in the old schools, which is the bureaucratic, administrative centre of the university. One in my undergraduate college, where I was educated, Jesus College, Cambridge. The Vice-Chancellor set about the Rustad statue in the old schools. And we wrote to him and we explained that if he took down that statue, and that's what they were wanting to do, and cancelled Rustad, he'd have a problem. Rustad was a major benefactor in the 17th century to the University Library in Cambridge, and he was also a director of the Royal African Company. And there was someone else who fitted exactly that profile, and that was George II. In fact, every monarch from Charles II through to George II had been a director, ex officio, of the Royal African Company. So if you cancel Rustad, we said, you're going to have to cancel all the monarchs of England from 1660 to 1760, when George II died. A whole century of English. Can you imagine how many monuments, documents, books in Cambridge are associated with these people? Retreat of Stout Party. You never heard about that one, but Rustad's statue is still there. Now turn to my undergraduate college. And this is a slightly complicated story. I'll try to summarize it. If you want to remove a Grade 1 monument from a Grade 1 building, the chapel of the college, which is the oldest college buildings in Cambridge, dating back to the 11th century, you need permission from the Church of England, a faculty it's called, and that opens up the opportunity essentially to take them to court, which is what we did. And in this case, it was me and a wonderful group of older alumni of the college who were incensed at the idea that one of the greatest funerary death monuments of the early modern period in this country, which has been on the walls of the chapel for 350 years, should be taken down and moved to what used to be the old bursary where I got my grant check in the days when they paid you to go to university. That would be a great thing if it ever came back. This is a 2.5-ton monument to this cavalier, carved in stone and marble by Grinling Gibbons, our greatest carver in wood and stone. So we're dealing with an important monument which they were going to remove. Well, to cut a long story short, we beat them in court in a 3-day hearing. We beat them in court. The result was that the master of the college publicly blamed the Church of England, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Welby, blamed the judge. Indeed. But I'm glad to say that Rustad's monument, you can go and see it, still is placed on the north wall of the chapel in Jesus College. But it hasn't, just to carry on, it doesn't stop there. And I want to just try to indicate how great institutions can make fools of themselves. The committee still continued in existence, the Legacy of Slavery Committee, and it produced a report. In its second paragraph, it admitted that the university and its colleges between them had never traded a slave, they had never owned slaves, they had never owned a plantation or had a share of ownership in a plantation. Nevertheless, guilt by association would be applied, and so they listed in various ways, mainly students at the university whose families had involvement in slavery in some way or another. How can a university be held responsible, as it were, for the financial dealings of its students and indeed their families, their fathers? Quite literally, fathers were named in this document. Now, this was a ludicrous piece of work, and ludicrous also for what it omitted. Because, as you probably know, the two greatest leaders of the anti-slavery movement, William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, were both educated at St. John's College, Cambridge. No mention. You perhaps have heard of the Clapham sect, the evangelical Christian Tory families who gathered around the Reverend John Venn in Holy Trinity Church on Clapham Common in the 1790s and early 1800s and formed together this phalanx that led the anti-slavery campaigns in this country. Most of the Clapham sect, most of the men in the Clapham sect were educated at Cambridge. Cambridge University had its very own branch of the Anti-Slavery Society in the 1820s. Manchester had a branch, Leeds had a branch, Cambridge University, not a city, just a university, had its branch as well. Now, the report was published and it was ridiculed in the press. I played a small role in that, I'm pleased to say. They had promised that it would be the basis of a book. The book never appeared. We thought the matter was finally closed. But now there is an exhibition at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. The Fitzwilliam is the university museum, one of the greatest museums in this country. It's entitled, and you would be ready for this kind of title, Rise Up, Resistance, Revolution, Abolition. And it's premised on a huge historical error. Go into the Fitzwilliam Museum and you'll be met by boards in the entrance that tell you that Earl Fitzwilliam himself, who gave the money for this great institution, and half of Cambridge's institutions were benefiting from slavery from the late 18th century onwards because they had invested in South Sea annuities. Okay, but this is based on a great confusion with South Sea securities. Now, they were marketed by the company, these securities, in the early 18th century. And those investments did indeed include the proceeds derived from the slave trade. It must be said that the company made very little out of it, out of the slave trade, but it is certainly the case that the securities were, as it were, based in a small part on profits derived from the trading of slaves from 1713 onwards. But South Sea annuities are entirely different. They are simply bonds issued by the government and marketed and sold by the South Sea Company, which had an office in London, and if you wanted to buy what were essentially gilts, as we would call them today, you went to the offices of the South Sea Company and you bought them. In doing so, of course, you were lending your money to the state and receiving interest in return. These were gilts, as we know today. They had nothing whatsoever to do with slavery. But on the basis that they had this connection, or indeed had the same name of the South Sea Company, a young researcher has convinced the Fitzwilliam Museum's director, the curators of the museum, the trustees of the museum, that much of the university profited hugely from slavery. It's a gross error. It's an obvious error. I assure you it did not. Nevertheless, in correspondence this month, when a group of notable historians, including Lord Andrew Roberts, including Sir Noel Malcolm, Fellow of All Souls, all of us educated at Cambridge, have pointed out this error to the director and others, we've been told in reply that this is merely a matter of interpretation, as if the difference between a government IOU and investments in the slave trade were actually the same thing, and they weren't different at all. Now, this is obviously a matter of fact, not interpretation, and they've relied upon a young researcher, and I don't wish to castigate young researchers, a young researcher who doesn't know which way's up, and it's an indication of the problem that we face. Problems of ignorance, error, and denial of facts have all taken root in a great university, and I'm afraid they must be uprooted, which in due course they will be. We've uprooted all the other myths about slavery, and we'll have to uproot this one as well. So watch this space. Now, from this latter remark, you'll perhaps gather that I'm optimistic. I think in the end, good academic history based on the facts objective and accurate and balanced and nuanced, will win out. And I think that because I recognize, and I'm sure we all do, that reality is beginning to bite. We can see that we're living through a period of change in which spurious ideologies will become irrelevant. If we cannot as a nation defend ourselves, if we cannot pay our bills, if we're forced to borrow until the lenders lose confidence in us, and that's coming soon, if we can't maintain decent public services or even fill the potholes in our roads, then all this play acting and posturing over matters of personal identity will eventually and probably rather quickly evaporate. And the role of history reclaimed is to speed these malign intellectual fashions on their way to oblivion. Going back to the beginning, I'd like to think that Professor Cheng Dan, who is now happily retired, would approve of what we're doing. He was a victim of one cultural revolution, which we can now see devastated China for a generation in the 1960s and 1970s. I think he'd approve of our attempts to stop another cultural revolution here in Britain. And one way to do that is to remind people of the many ways in which Britain and British history continue to be admired around the world, in China in particular. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lawrence. What a fantastic speech. Very, very interesting indeed. And I'm glad somebody's fighting the good fight because we desperately need it. As this is a locals event, we want to take some questions from the audience because we want your involvement into this. So I think my lovely assistant Roland is at the back there with a roving mic. So if anybody has any questions, can you please put your hand up and then we'll get to you. Roland, the lady there.
Hello, thank you very much. That's very interesting. You say you think there's hope for the future with history. How long do you envisage sort of the turnaround? Because Bridget Phillipson, now as the Education Secretary, her vision for history in schools is not great for the traditional history of our country.
Yes, I share your fears, and one of the things that History Reclaimed doesn't do is focus on schools, or at least we don't focus enough on schools. I mean, we're a group of university historians, and we know the academic world, and that's where, our roots are. And you're quite right, I don't disagree with you for bringing this up at all. Schools are very, very crucial. I just think that historical fashions change, and we all know that historical eras change as well. And I think that, the left and those who would debase British history have had a run for their money. But I think all that will change. I mean, you may say I'm too much of an optimist, but I think that we're going to enter a much more difficult period in our history. And people will look back and want to take different examples. And they will learn some harsh lessons in the coming years. I think that's very obvious. And in the process, I would expect syllabuses, teachers, their university courses to change back towards a proper understanding of history in its context and the proper use of evidence. And indeed, one hopes, if I have anything to do with it, I'm sure it will be the case, that gross error will be removed from historical studies. But you're absolutely right to focus on the problem in schools, and that is a major theme. We held a conference, History Reclaimed, in Cambridge last summer, And Catherine Birbalsingh was really our key turn. She's a remarkable figure and enormously entertaining as well as courageous in all ways. And she spoke about exactly this problem. But she at least is fighting the good fight.
Gentleman here.
Thanks very much. Like what you said, especially because my wife and I happen to be alumni of possibly the only university in the world named after Cecil John Rhodes.
Really?
And I grew up in the only country named after him.
Rhodesia.
Rhodesia.
Yeah.
And we have direct experience of having those change, street names transformed, statues removed, symbols of stuff that people found inconvenient, just eradicated. And right now, the reality is people are looking back and going, well, where has that got us? Where are we actually going? You know, words matter. And when we see words up there, we think, yeah, warts and all, at least we appreciate what was. So thank you very much for what you said.
Yes. Shall we take thank you. Take some more. Yes.
Hi. Have you thought about writing a new curriculum for schools that teaches the real history of the Middle East and slavery? So we don't get the kind of protests we see at the moment raging through the country.
Yeah.
So when we get a real Conservative government, we're ready to go from the get-go, like Trump 2025, not Trump 2016.
Yeah. Indeed. Thank you. Yes, in fact, you can find on our website our preferred syllabus for history from Key Stage 1 all the way up to GCSE and A-level. And we sent it to Bridget Phillipson a few weeks ago because they did have a period when you could send in, your written comments and so forth on the curriculum review. So we did. We don't expect a response, but we'll watch carefully. But we do have a view, and it's obviously a curriculum that is based on British history and getting people to understand, children to understand where they come from. And it is quite traditional, Romans and Anglo-Saxons and Normans. And we're focusing above all on developing the historical imagination of children at an early stage. So they do identify with different civilizations and different ways of thinking. And that, I think, remembering our own historical educations, that curiosity to find out about the past and about difference is really at the heart of it. It is not a curriculum, at least our view, is not a curriculum based on relevance, because relevance is narrowing. In the end, what relevance means is we will reflect back into the past what we are focusing on here and now in our own society, and the past is then homogenized with the present. It just becomes a mirror image of what it is we're doing today and what we're thinking. So our aim has been to entirely diversify the curriculum and get children, to identify and understand the past in its own terms. It's crammed full of stuff. I think the criticism of what we've put in front of the powers that be is that it may be a little bit too ambitious. But nonetheless, we want, as it were, people to immerse themselves in the past. I'm a great believer, although I'm a modern historian. One of the things that has saddened me has been the decline of medieval history in our schools over the course of my career. And I'm always excited when, a young medievalist appears aged 17 or 18 for an Oxford interview, because that gives diversity, real diversity, intellectual diversity to the study of history in any university. Yeah, thank you.
Somebody at the top there,
So I'm someone who's currently in the schooling system, and I'm actually very horrified about the state of history teaching. A few years ago, when we studied the Tudors, we had an entire lesson about Henry VIII's Moroccan trumpet player, but not a single lesson on the Spanish Armada or Mary Queen of Scots. We could subject to entire assemblies about slavery, Black History Month, self-guilt, and how we ought to be guilty for our past. And it's just not welcome in this country. It goes against our very sense of Britishness. And we're not guilty of what happened hundreds of years ago. The school is massively captured by this ideology. And it needs to be fought. It is creating a sense of self-loathing. There was a recent thing that showed a very, only less than half of this generation practice. It's just absolutely gone ballistic. And we need to be proud to be British. And it's being destroyed by a schooling system that generates a sense of self-loathing. And history, it needs to be something which teaches us about how to be and how we can reflect on past wrongs and make them current rights. But that doesn't mean we have to be guilty. And I watched this video of people in London lined up, all guilty of what happened in the past. And it's just really, really wrong. And I'm very glad you're fighting it. And also, I don't report about young ladies. England.
Yes. Now, can I ask you, sir, are you still in school?
Yes.
And you're a sixth former?
Year 11.
Year 11. Okay. And I hope you're taking history GCSE.
Yes, I'm set for a grade 9.
Ah, good. Excellent. Will it be history A-level as well?
I'm going up to Thomas Hardy School in Dorchester to study history at A-level.
Wonderful. Well, you yourself, sir, will be a one-man deterrent to all the nonsense. And if I may say so, well done for coming here today as well. Well done.
It's the minority that are in pushing this agenda, but the majority think it's a bit ridiculous. There's our silent voices.
Here.
Thanks. We spoke of museums and monuments and formal structures of education, but in my experience, certainly for my children, most children and young people these days catch the word of mind virus from a Netflix series or a children's book in Asda supermarket or something like this. I'm constantly vetting what they read and what they watch. So how do we counter this? I mean, is it a question of cutting off funding? In which case we're going to need to get into government, or something's going to need to get into government to do that, or are there other ways that we can counter that?
Well, thank you, sir. And I completely sympathise with your points. I'm a father too, though my children are in their 30s now, and it wasn't quite the same when they were at school. There's a great deal that you yourself are doing, I can sense from your remarks, and I know that my wife and I, and I'm sure it's true of the audience, I didn't think in those days we were against the schooling they were getting, but we did feel we had to add perspective and context and take them out and show them things and put things in different ways, which we did, I hope, to some effect. And I would say to everyone, grandparents amongst you as well, that there's a role to be played through the family in education. But you put your finger, and others have put their finger on the real problem. And I come to you only able to talk about my sector, but I agree with you that we have to think more broadly about, if you like, the structures of influence across our society, and that involves media, and that involves schooling, and so forth. All I'd say is is that this problem, let's put it that way, this cultural development has emerged in the past 10, 15, 20 years, and in that sense there is hope that a different complex of thought, a different way of thinking about national history can also emerge, can re-emerge, of course, in this case. When one meets the kinds of people who make TV programs, who make Netflix documentaries and series and so forth, they're not particularly well educated. That's often the point. They're easily influenced. They're influenced by what's going on around them now. So we have to change those influences. The fact that 20 years ago they started gives me some hope that if we are concerted, and as our friend up in the gallery pointed out, if the silent majority no longer stay silent, but begin to ask for better history, better culture, a better understanding of our national past, then maybe change can be engineered, if you like. But I entirely sympathise with your problem, and I don't have a simple solution to it.
Hands, just over here.
See, I'm not as sanguine as you are about the change that will come. We spoke earlier, I was raised on Asia, lived in Zimbabwe for 17 years post-independence. I have looked closely at what happened in the Soviet Union with education in Nazi Germany, and the key thing that we need to do to change this is not to change the government. As we've seen with the previous Conservative government, it's the civil servants who actually control and who are deeply imbued with the sort of neo-Marxist ideologies. A good example is London Rycroft, the Permanent Secretary of State for the Home Office. Just have a look at his career and what he stands for and represents, and you'll see why someone like Suella Braverman, they managed to sack her as Home Secretary because she was opposing things that he fundamentally believes in. And it's the same with education. It's not going to change as long as you have a core of civil servants who cannot be sacked, who are imbued with this ideology. So you have to have some sort of denazification program if you're going to succeed. It's going to change in our life.
Well, I can't disagree that the civil service clearly is out of control. It's out of ministerial control. It's out of parliamentary control, and it has become, a major block on change and progress and common sense. And so much that we see, of course, can be put down to what Michael Gove called the blob. I think there are other words we might use, but the blob will do. Let me add. I mean, I can't disagree with you, but let me add a further set of problems, which are museum and gallery trustees. In the 18th century, there was this wonderful phrase that we use, self-perpetuating oligarchies. And trustees of our major museums are self-perpetuating oligarchies. They have it in their power to appoint new trustees. They appoint people like themselves, and the whole thing kind of ripples through history, as it were, and for decades you find that the same kinds of people are in control. But again, I have some optimism. There was a piece in the Times this week about Tate Britain. Tate Britain has been at the leading edge of nonsense in our society for some years, but it turns out that many people are no longer going, and that the numbers of people attending the museum have dropped off a cliff. cliff. And of course, it's obvious why, because if you go there, it's a bit like meeting agitprop. I mean, it's no longer an art gallery, it's telling you social history, but these curators don't know enough social history to tell it properly, and make, lots of obvious mistakes. And I think people don't want to be lectured to. They don't want a didactic experience, they want to enjoy art, and they're interested in the art. I've gone somewhat further from the point, but as it were, there is a sense in which, whether as voters or whether as consumers of culture, we can simply vote with our feet. And one of the things, one looks, and here I know I'm entering a political field, but one looks for a clear determination on the part of politicians who are wanting our votes to talk about the reform of our bureaucracy, to talk about the reform of our civil service. Clearly it's grown too large, and something apparently is being done about that. But there is a sense that it's now a block on healthy change in our society, and it's time that the administration was cut down to size. We've been here before in our history. If anyone knows that term, old corruption, there was a huge movement against placemen and sinecure holders in government in the early 19th century. And eventually an age of reform from the 1830s onwards swept them away. But it was a vast popular movement that was required to do that. Read about William Cobbett. He was the great hammer of old corruption, and it might be said that we need a Cobbett today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence Goldman.
Yeah.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter. and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.